Hi everyone. This presentation was created for a First Nations Agricultural Forum organized by ACTC, but rather than talking about how to grow or raise your own food, this presentation is focused on how to pay attention to what is already out there and waiting to be used. You know the phrase, go with the flow? It's more like that, or even a laid-back type of gardening. Once you start paying closer attention to what exists around you, you start to realize just how much access you have to useful items that most people are blind to. It doesn't have to mean you go out and harvest it all, but it really opens your eyes to the world around you. That bouquet of wildflowers your granddaughter picks for you? Edible. The spruce tree in your front yard? Edible. Fido? Edible. Just kidding. Don't eat Fido. Just making sure you're listening. Fun fact, the photo there is from a little foraging challenge we did last October on a hike. It was a bit late in the season, but you can see that we still found 9 edible items. So I thought I'd start this off with a little brain-teasing question. Does anyone know what plant this is? I know, it's a tough one. That's right, it's a dandelion. Follow-up question, did you know that it was edible? Have you ever eaten a dandelion in some form? The entire plant is edible and it has a wide variety of uses. Dandelion was originally brought over as an intentional food crop. Yep, I repeat, it was brought over on purpose, to grow as food. But it escaped and it is doing its own thing and seems to be doing quite well. The petals are quite mild and can be added to baking like cookies, waffles, or pasta dough. We have an oatmeal cookie recipe that we love, and so I've got copies for anyone who'd like one. When spring finally rolls around, I think it would be a great activity to do with your kids or grandkids. And if you grab a copy, you'll give me hope that I've convinced a few more people to have an open mind about eating wild foods. Dandelion greens have a bit of a reputation for being bitter, but if you choose younger greens that are more shaded, you should find this to be lessened. Though some would argue that we've forgotten that we need a little bit of bitter in our lives, and we've just gotten out of that habit. Nibble them to find out. I mean, be 100% sure it's a dandelion that you're eating and that it's from a clean area first, but I think we ought to learn to do a little sampling while we're out in nature sometimes. You can add them straight into a salad mixed with some milder greens, or you can soak them in boiling water, which will also reduce the bitterness like I did with the egg dish that you see there. And the roots. I have become just a wee bit obsessed with the roots. You can peel and roast them up like you do a root vegetable if you like. Some people have mistaken this picture here for being parsnips or another root veggie, so that just makes sense, right? But my favorite thing to do is to slice them up into small pieces and roast them in the oven. You get the most amazing chocolatey smell when you do that. Then you can grind them up and they can be used as a substitute for cocoa in baking. Or you can make them into a hot drink that people use as a coffee substitute, or sweeten them with a little bit of honey like we like to, and you get something closer to a hot chocolate. But that's not even all. You can also pickle the buds of the flowers before they spring up, or even use the stem as a drinking straw. And there's a tire company that is using the milky latex liquid that the dandelions produce and making it into a new kind of environmentally friendly rubber. All of this from one simple plant that most people consider a weed, and that people spend ridiculous amounts of time, effort, and money towards getting rid of. But even if you don't want to eat them, I'd ask that you at least consider letting them exist in your lawn so that the bees and other pollinators can enjoy them. Anyone getting into beekeeping will notice that they are a handy food source in the spring. Now, dandelions, how hard are they to find? Not that hard. They can actually be found on every single continent except Antarctica, which is why most people recognize it pretty easily and don't have too much trouble finding a patch. It is also why dandelions have become a bit of a symbol for resistance. And I personally think that is kind of awesome. We could all learn to be a bit more like dandelions. They are both cheery and tough. As for what they cost, well, $4.29 US or about $5.74 Canadian is what came up when I did a quick internet search. for that little bundle of dandelion leaves there. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't pay that. However, it shows you your first wild food opportunity. There are people in this world willing to pay $6 for a handful of dandelion greens, and I know that you are more than capable of going out there and picking some for them. All right. Well, that's a taste of what I've got to offer you. If you're still on board, then we're going to go through a few things here. Quick intro on who I am and how I found wild foods, or they found me. We'll go over a few naming definitions, chat about a few ways that you and your community could look at using wild foods in a profitable way, and then I'll follow that with why you might just want to add them to your table. And we'll take a quick peek at a handful of useful wild plants and wrap up with a few guidelines and things to think about. All right, so a little bit about me. I was born and raised on a dairy farm. We had a great big garden, and when I became a teenager, we sold the cows and got into elk and bison, which means I was somewhat accustomed to many aspects of agricultural lifestyle, but I probably couldn't have told you many of the names of the plants you'd find just growing in the ditch or a pasture. When I left home, I trained to become a computer programmer, but I later went back to school to become a dietitian. And my first job out of university was to move to the very far north of Saskatchewan and work with the Dene people there. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the area, but essentially you just head north from anywhere in Saskatchewan and stop when the road ends. Just don't expect it to be a good road. We personally traveled by plane most of the time. So during my years up there, I worked on a wide variety of food-related projects, some of which you may have tried in your own communities. One of the biggest differences, though, was that those communities mostly had sand and very little soil to work with, which meant we had to focus mostly on container-style gardening and import potting soil, which I can tell you was not dirt cheap. I was also told right from the start that most Dene didn't eat vegetables, which is what got me thinking. What did the Dene of the past traditionally consume? The land certainly offered fish and game, but what plant foods were available to them? This was a puzzle to solve in my free time. And that was the start. I started reading and learning and eating weeds more and more. And these are some of the wild foods that I first dabbled with. So you can see there's fireweed, low bush cranberries, also known as lingonberries, blueberries, Labrador or muskeg tea, bunchberry, juniper, rose petals and hips, and birch sap was a fun one. And there were many more. Okay, so we're going to tackle a few names or definitions here. So weed is any wild plant that grows in a garden or field where it is not wanted. That's can mean a lot of things. Weed can also reference cannabis, which does make for a little confusion, but in our case, we're just sticking to this definition. Next, we have non-native. Sometimes also they use the term introduced, which refers to a species that originated somewhere other than its current location and has been introduced to the area where it now lives. There's also feral, existing in a wild state, especially describing a plant or animal that was previously kept by people. So our dandelion from the first slides would be in the feral category. It has escaped. Was supposed to be kept by people, but it has escaped and is doing its own thing. So in many cases, plants that have these labels, like weed, non-native, introduced, and feral, tend to be on the opportunistic or possibly even a little on the aggressive side. And then we have the term wild food, which is broader and can include native plants as well. They are things that grow spontaneously and instinctively in nature with no intervention or control by people. It can also be a term that's a little more palatable, for instance. So when you're like doing a presentation that is mostly about plants that people consider weeds, you might look a smidge classier. I hope. And just in case you aren't familiar with the term foraging, I thought I'd throw it in here. It is the act of searching for and collecting wild food resources such as fruits, nuts, mushrooms, and berries. And that photo there is Canada thistle and a bunch of tasty dishes that we cooked up with it. So, surprise, thistle is edible. The land provides everything that anybody would need. If you take only what you need, the land renews itself so that it can provide more. David Alexander Robertson. So I think this is a solid quote and one that we should keep in mind if we're using the land in any way, whether it's for agricultural purposes or harvesting wild plants. And this is one area where there can be a bit of criticism in foraging, as there are always those bad eggs out there who don't consider the balance and feel they are entitled to just take, or those that aren't informed and end up harming rare and endangered plants, or just people who take from areas that they shouldn't. But in general, the more connected a person becomes with their environment, the more they tend to care about it. And it is a little bit weird, but you might find that when you start recognizing and naming the plants that you see every day, they almost become your friends and you start to pay more attention to them. You might even go out of your way to scatter their seeds or give them a bit of water, but maybe skip that step with your super aggressive plant friends. Hey? Ultimately, acknowledging and caring about wild plants might give purpose to and protect land, providing new ways to add usefulness outside of industries like logging or agriculture. So, a starter philosophy here, a good philosophy that you can begin with, is to focus on the non-native or feral plants that grow in abundance and tend to annoy everyone else. So, a book like this, Weeds of the Prairies, might point you in the right direction. I received this book as a Christmas gift this year, and I was super stoked, like super stoked, but not for the reasons probably intended by the authors. It's a collaboration between the government of Alberta and the University of Saskatchewan, so it has solid information along with photos of stages of life for each plant and ways to identify your weeds. So I think it's a great resource. Just be sure to confirm that they are edible with another resource, because this publication isn't focused on whether you can eat them or not. And so I'm calling this the advanced philosophy. If you like reading, you might want to check out Braiding Sweetgrass. It combines both traditional knowledge and modern science. And one component of this book is about a research study that they did on the effects of harvesting sweetgrass. So the end results were that in harvesting the plant in an honorable way, it helped it to thrive in comparison to the plants that were left completely untouched and not bothered by humans at all. So this is proof that if it's done responsibly, there can be reciprocal benefits for harvesting even native wild plants that we want to continue to encourage growing in our environment. But it has to be done in a mindful way. So whatever area you're harvesting in, it is a good idea to learn more about it. And I just have these couple examples here. My understanding is that lady slippers have medicinal value, and you can eat the bulbs of the western red lily, but sadly both are becoming scarce these days, and so they are protected. It's illegal to actually pick the western red lily if someone's found guilty of injuring, picking, or destroying any part of it. As our provincial flower and a flower that's getting scarcer, a person could face a fine of up to $500. But if you really wanted to, you can purchase the seeds and grow your own, and then you can harvest them if you want, or just work towards making more for our province, I suppose. But in general, for plants, when you are harvesting the roots or the bulbs, it just takes a lot more time and energy for the plant to renew those parts. So harvesting leaves, petals, fruits, or seeds are the much more sustainable options. And I thought this was an interesting quote when I first read it. If you look at which plants the herbicides are designed to kill, 80% of them are nutritious and delectable edibles such as chickweed, purslane, and lamb's quarters. Lita Meredith. So the top photo there is of purslane, a common weed that shows up in gardens. It is super nutritious and the best source of omega-3s in a leafy green format. In many countries around the world, it is sold in markets and valued as an excellent vegetable. Here in North America, it ends up on our list of things to eliminate. The lower photo is of lamb's quarters, which is also known as wild spinach, and for good reason. It can be eaten in pretty much all the same ways, and it actually beats spinach in several nutritional categories. Both plants are in our weed book, but both are also grown as crops in other countries. So that is my first suggestion to you. Opportunity number 1, if you can't beat them, then grow them. Why are we wasting energy killing these nutritious hardy crops? It's probably not going to make me very popular with the farming crowd, but I think there's an opportunity to grow these crops here. And this photo here is of a purslane crop in another country. And why not? They are extremely hardy and drought resistant. If you think back to years that have been dry and have poor weather, what do you see that still grows? The wheats. So in the farming presentation we had earlier, there was a photo of a field of barley that was overrun with dandelions and it was going to be sprayed. So why not just skip the barley altogether and bring back the dandelions as the food crop they were intended to be? As far as I know, this is an untapped opportunity, but I suppose I would recommend that you do be a good neighbor and consider whether your weedy crop is close enough to mingle with anyone else's non-weedy crop. And if anyone does decide to grow these as crops, please let me know. It would seriously make my year to know that someone was trying it. So opportunity number 2 is to gather wild foods to sell to a specialized company. So I don't know if you're aware of the company Boreal Heartland out of Orange, but if you aren't, you might want to check into their business model. They work with northern indigenous harvesters to collect wild items for them, and then they turn them into teas and dried products to be sold throughout the province. So if you happen to be in their area, you might be able to sell raw product to them directly. And they also provide annual education to their harvesters through a partnership with Northland College. And I think this is an excellent idea. My husband and I took the online training and it was quite good. But on the other hand, if you aren't in their area, there might be an opportunity for a group to consider forming their own business and giving them a little healthy competition. Or you can maybe approach Boreal Heartland and see if they'd like to perhaps partner in some way. And so here are a few photos of their operation and the 4 teas that they offer, which are quite good. Opportunity number 3, gather to sell directly to a market or a restaurant. So if you can find a farmer's market or a restaurant who's interested in a certain wild food, you can simply sell directly. And so there's lots of options here. Maybe they're interested in wild rice or maybe berries. But I have a photo of mushrooms here because Saskatchewan is home to several types of gourmet mushrooms, which fetch a good price. And gathering mushrooms is more like gathering fruit. The harvesting process itself is not typically harmful to the fungus, which is mostly underground. However, it is still considered good etiquette to leave some behind. So typically for all wild food, a rule of 3 is considered. They generally encourage you to take a third for your own harvest, leave a third for the animals, and leave the final third to create future crops. So for mushrooms, you might also want to gather them in a mesh bag or a loosely woven basket. This will keep your harvest in better shape, but it also allows for mushroom spores to fall to the ground while you're walking, and this might possibly start a future crop of mushrooms for you later. Just be sure that you know what you are gathering, as there are some dangerous mushrooms out there. A surprising number of wild things are edible, but we can't just assume that everything is. And in today's digital age, this could also mean selling through an online market. So Forage.market is a relatively new service that is aimed at helping people buy and sell wild foods. So you can sell both the raw ingredients or food products, like a jelly or a syrup, for example. It is a free service to use, and it is based out of the United States. They take 10% commission on any sales made, and you ship directly to the customers. Opportunity number 4 is to create products that incorporate wild plants. So as I mentioned before, my family raises bison, and as part of that, my mom has been making soap for decades using the bison tallow. And once I became interested in wild plants, I may have convinced her to start using a few in her soap recipes. So we brought a few bars for people at the forum, and they were quite popular. But if you'd like to try them yourself, you can get them at the locations listed or purchase online at buffalocharlie.com and use the coupon code DWDSOAP for 10% off your order. I also think this is a good example of how wild plants can complement other agricultural endeavors. If you decide to raise bison or beef, for instance, you could consider doing a project like this. Or if you keep bees, you could infuse the honey with wild plants. There are just so many possibilities. I'm probably not going to be great on pronunciation, but I also wanted to highlight the Nagik products because I think they are awesome. I'm not sure if there are that many wild plants incorporated into the products themselves, but I think they are worth mentioning because I enjoy them and because they are based on the sense of important wild plants, and they include fun informational blurbs that teach people more about the plants. People get to learn the Cree word for the plant in question, as well as a fact or two, and I think that is just great. Again, wild foods are a very complimentary item because they just pop up without any trouble on your behalf. So even if you don't want to grow them purposefully or go out into the wild to forage for them, there is a good chance that you will find yourself with them in your garden or fruit orchard or lawn. This is still an opportunity to weed them out and set them aside to make some soup for lunch or to say sell those dandelions to some suckers at the farmer's market along with your fruit harvest. Oh yeah, a bright fellow mentioned that you should probably label those dandelions as organic too. Then you can likely get $7 for the bunch. Just saying. Or if there's a particular weed you like, you could just let it thrive in one corner of your space like I did with this lamb's quarter. Yes, they can grow to about 10 feet tall. And yes, I am lucky that my farmer relations haven't disowned me yet. But they might. And now for a few reasons why you should just add foraging to your personal life and diet. Reason number one, the connection to nature and reconnecting to knowledge that elders may hold. So foraging allows people to connect with nature and learn about plants and animals that live in their local area. This photo is of Eleanor Hegland, a traditional knowledge keeper that I worked with and learned from while organizing some walks in the woods up north. We had a great time, and it was really nice to see that a lot of the participants remembered different plants that their families used when they were children. Reason number two, cost savings. These are foods that are free, and there are no grocery stores involved. Foraging can be a way to save money on groceries by finding free sources of food in the wild. Maybe you want a salad to go with that bison roast you made. You don't have to go to a grocery store. Just wander outside and pick some wild greens, and you are good to go. Reason number three, the health benefits. Wild foods can provide a wide variety of vitamins and minerals that are often missing from a typical modern diet. There are lots of great foods in the produce section of the grocery store, but when you think about it, it's gotten pretty streamlined. There is just one type of carrot, maybe one or two types of potatoes, but overall there's not that much variety. If you add in some wild foods, you'll be broadening your options. And you can receive health benefits by simply being out in nature. Spending 2 hours a week in nature is recommended for optimum health benefits, including improved mental health, lower cardiovascular risks, reduced blood pressure, and pain reduction. This has all been proven in scientific studies. Foraging can be a fun way to spend time outdoors and can also be a great way to spend time with friends and family. It can also be an educational experience, providing a deeper understanding of nature and the environment and the plants that grow in it. And by teaching the younger generation, hopefully they will grow up with a deeper connection to nature and its gifts. Reason number 5, the unique flavors. Foraging can open up new culinary possibilities and allow you to experiment with unique flavors and ingredients you can't find in a grocery store. Plus, they are just fresher and taste better in general. Have you ever compared a wild strawberry to a store-bought one? Wild strawberries might be smaller and take more effort to collect, but they are tastier and so much better. So here are a few plants that we are going to start with. Now, all of these lovely specimens can be found in the Weeds of the Prairies book. So I think we can safely assume that they can be harvested freely and without risk of rendering them too scarce. So we're going to start off here with pineapple weed, also known as wild chamomile. So probably your best identifying feature is going to be the scent. When you crush the flowers and leaves, you're going to get a fruity pineapple scent. And you can see there too that the flowers, they have no petals. They basically are just the center of the flower. Then they also have these finely divided leaves, and they like to grow in hard-packed areas. So the one thing to note there is those hard-packed areas often are kind of high traffic, so you want to make sure that your patch isn't somewhere that the dog routinely pees or that you're driving over with your car every day. You want to make sure that you're picking from a clean area. So what can you do with them? Well, like regular chamomile, they are good for tea. You make up brew up a tea and it can help you with your sleep. You can also put the flower buds straight into a salad for a fruity flavor, or just nibble on them as a snack. The flowers can also be added to baking or puddings. One of our favorite things to do with them there are those cookies that I'm holding. And for those, you put the flower buds into butter and infuse it overnight before baking with it, and it just gives the cookies an amazing fruity flavor. And also, the entire plant is said to repel insects. So I haven't actually tried this, but it's not an unpleasant scent. So if you ever find yourself in the bush being eaten alive by insects, I would totally recommend grabbing a plant and rubbing it on your skin and seeing if that works. And you can report back to me if it does. And next up is stinging nettle. It likes moist, shady areas. And as the name suggests, it does have stinging hairs on the stems that produce a skin reaction, which it has a fair reputation for. And I don't know about you, but me as a kid, I was always afraid I was going to run into a stinging nettle patch. I didn't know what they looked like. I just knew that they existed and they could hurt me. So case in point, if someone would have trained me as to what they looked like, it probably would have helped me out as a child. But I think although the sting is a little bit uncomfortable, like with most things, we tend to build it up in our minds worse than it really is. So as an adult, when I was learning to ID it, I, probably looked like I was off my rocker, but I immediately grabbed a leaf and rubbed it on my hand to see what would happen. And then I was kind of excited when I broke out into a rash. I don't know if I'd recommend that, but it is one way to tell if you've got a stinging nettle. Other ways are to look at it. It's tall, sometimes up to 6 feet or so, with square stems, and it has opposite toothed leaves. So sometimes people have shown me photos and they're like, is this a nettle? And if it has like a soft scalloped edge, that's an indication that it is not the right plant, because I find stinging nettles have kind of that sharp, aggressive look to the edge of the leaves. And just going back to the stinging, there are those who actually intentionally get stung and feel that it has health benefits. So they call it urtication, and it's thought to help with the pain of arthritis and joint pain. So some people will do that on purpose. Stinging nettle is actually really nutritious for you. It's rich in vitamins and minerals like calcium, iron, magnesium, potassium, zinc, and vitamin C, A, and K. So you can use the greens like spinach in soups, smoothies, pestos, and so on. But you can also use the seeds like you see here in the photo while they're still green before they change color to like black. You can harvest them and you can add them to things like granola bars or energy balls or things like that. They are also a nutritious, edible piece of the stinging nettle. And here we have lamb's quarters, uh, also known as wild or northern spinach, and I did mention it before. It's a crop that's grown in other countries, and it's one of the earliest crops, dating back 3,500 years. It is also known as pigweed, which is where I want to call attention to the scientific name up there, Chenopodium album. Sometimes this name is important because people will call things all sorts of different common names, and people really like to call a large number of plants by the name pigweed. I guess a pig eats it and it's pigweed. I don't know. Or they just don't like it, so they call it pigweed. Whatever the case is, you sometimes do need to use that scientific or Latin name, sometimes people will call it, to make sure that you're talking about the same weed, because otherwise there can be some confusion. So lamb's quarters has alternate diamond-shaped leaves, and one of its key identifying features is the back side of the leaves have this white, mealy particles, which is waterproof, which is kind of cool sometimes. You can see the water droplets on it and gets all sparkly. If you're eating it, you don't have to worry about removing that coating. It is kind of a little bit of a natural wax, but it won't hurt you. You can totally eat it. And the plant also gets dense clusters of gray-green flowers. So they kind of look almost more like little balls than the traditional flower you'd be used to. Lamb's quarters have more protein, calcium, phosphorus, iron, and vitamin C than spinach. And it's free. You do not have to go to the grocery store and go buy some spinach. You can just step outside and get some free lamb's quarters and you'll be ahead of the game. So it can be eaten in salads, just raw, or you can also cook it. It can be added to pizzas, smoothies, or dips. You can blanch it and freeze it for later so that you can have a supply throughout the winter. It is excellent in omelets, frittatas, and quiche. And it's related to quinoa, so the seeds are also edible. You can harvest those in the fall if you'd like. And when I say you can hide it in pizza, you really can add a whole layer of lamb's quarters to your homemade pizza, and no one will really notice. I have tested this on my husband, and he can be a little picky, and it didn't bother him at all. So if you have a picky eater, it may be a way to sneak in some extra veggies and nutrition. And this here is dock. So it's often found in ditches. It belongs in the buckwheat family. It grows in a basal rosette, and you can also eat the young greens. I chose this one mainly though because right now it is winter, and if you keep your eyes open, you can probably spot it on your drive home today. The seeds stay on the plants all winter, and they are tall enough that the tops of them stick out of the snow. So you might get a bit cold and wet if you go snowbank diving, but you could technically harvest these seeds right now in the middle of winter and give them a try. And if you did do that, what you need to do are gather up the seeds and then you roast them for a few minutes and grind them into a flour. So this is a gluten-free flour, meaning that it won't bind and rise like normal bread flour would, but you can substitute up to 50% of it for baking in things that do need to bind and rise, so in your breads or what have you. Or you can use 100% of it in things that will remain flat, so things like crackers, brownies, or cookies. And someone piped up in the presentation the first time and said that, tortillas would also be a good option, and they were correct. You could add 100% to tortillas. The only consideration there is that the flavor also is different. You may or may not like it at 100 at full strength, but you should definitely give it a try. So this is a free way to make your store-bought flour last longer. You can stretch it out further by adding 25-50% of free dock flour. But it's also a way to eat healthier if you're trying to avoid white flour products. Adding in dock flour will add more fiber and nutrition, and so it won't affect your blood sugar so much, which makes it a great addition for diabetics. A few guidelines just to get us started. The first would be to look at your choice of area. So you want to be careful not to pick in areas that have been sprayed with herbicides, fungicides, or pesticides. And you want to pick at least 50 to 100 feet from a busy road and avoid picking near power lines or railroad tracks. So this kind of comes into the same reasoning. You want it to be a clean area. You don't want there to be nasty chemical runoff, and things like power lines and railroad tracks tend to be sprayed because they want to keep the weeds down in those areas. And then you also want to obey any rules, laws and regulations in the area. It's not always okay to pick in all places. Some have laws against that. Next, you want proper identification. So be 100% sure you have the right plant before you pick or consume it. In today's age, there are some awesome technological advances. So there are apps that you can use just on your phone, like the Seek app is one of my favorites. And you simply point it at the plant, and there's a good chance it will tell you what it is or put you in the right direction. The only caution I have there is that they aren't 100% right all the time, so you want to make sure that you're also double checking that with a field guide or a person who knows. Just don't put all your identification responsibilities onto a single source. It's always good to double up or triple up on that and make sure that you have the right plant. Next is to be aware of and avoid any poisonous or harmful plants in your area. So that goes back to learning a bit about your area. When I talked about the rare and endangered plants, you also want to know what the poisonous or harmful ones are. And that kind of includes stinging nettle, I imagine, which we know is both nutritious and a little bit painful. So with that, you probably just want to take some gloves out, but there are other ones you might want to avoid, like poison ivy or water hemlock. And finally, just talk to traditional knowledge keepers or local experts if possible. And the traditional knowledge keepers will probably have a lot more to say and a lot more information about the native plants in your area. They may not have quite as much knowledge to draw on with some of these non-native plants that came along later, but just ask questions to anyone who happens to know about them, and you'll hopefully learn a lot. And finally, just to be respectful. So we want to take a sustainable amount of resources from an area to ensure the continued health of the ecosystem. And again, here with that starter philosophy, if you're picking the plants that, are non-native, are feral, are on the aggressive side, then you don't have to worry so much about that sustainable amount. In fact, you're helping the ecosystem usually by removing some of those plants, but just make sure that you know what you're taking and how that affects your environment. And you also want to consider the wildlife and other individuals who may be using the area, and maybe go back to that rule of three. So harvest a third for yourself, leave a third for the wildlife, and leave a third for future harvests. At least if you're picking things that are native, that for sure is something that you want to be following. And I just wanted to make a little note about giving thanks. Even though we have mainly focused on plants that are considered nuisances and won't be missed by many, there are people that would feel that it's still appropriate to show gratitude when picking any plants from the wild. So you need to choose what's right for you. Some people choose to give a gift of tobacco or a bit of water, maybe a piece of hair or a song, or it may just be that you want to say a prayer or a word of thanks before harvesting. But I think it's always good to have gratitude, no matter what we're doing in our lives. In summary, wild foods both have profitable opportunities and make an excellent, nutritious, and free addition to your household menu. And the nice thing about them are that there's very few inputs necessary to get you started. So you just have to follow the basic guidelines and make sure that you have proper IDs and clean areas that you're picking from. I hope that everyone was able to take away at least one small idea from this presentation. If you are interested in learning more about eating weeds, you can check out my YouTube channel for more information and recipes. I'm still adding new videos regularly. Hopefully you have some mentors and some local experts that you can tap into, but if you feel that you need more help, feel free to drop me a line. Thanks for listening.